Hi everybody, today is Friday, February 28th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is back with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Nice to be back.
Let's get started with the meeting between Starmer and Donald Trump. We had a series of meeting between the European leaders and Donald Trump, Polish president, and then Emmanuel Macron, and right now Starmer, and we had yesterday. And it seems that Zelensky is going to meet with Donald Trump today. What is your take on what has happened in these meetings so far, and how do you find the differences? Is there any sort of difference between these meetings?
Yes, there are very significant differences between the way in which President Trump received and spoke with President Macron of France, and the way in which the meetings with Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of England or Britain, took place on Thursday. Uh, let's go to the first part of your question. Uh, Trump is behaving in a stable and consistent way. He does not understand the detail of any of the major issues currently involved in first the end of war negotiations, and second, the so called minerals agreement with the Ukraine. Um, he does not understand the detail, and Macron was much better able to uh, exploit his disabilities and pacify Trump's relatively short fuse. He has both short concentration span, his cognition is damaged, he repeats himself over and over with the same slogans. And if listeners want, they can go to the Dances with Bears reports where I quote exactly what was said. When you quote exactly what Trump says with the ums, the ahs, the hesitations, the repeats, which is not what the transcript services, for example, rollcall.com, runs a transcript of what happens. The White House has stopped providing transcripts. When you compare the transcript and the newspaper reports with the actual remarks, you see Trump cognitively damaged. The man is handicapped both in understanding what he's being asked, understanding what he's hearing from his counterparts, um, and understanding what, in fact, is under negotiation. That's why, and it's very interesting to see, he has the vice president, J.D. Vance sitting with him in the meetings. Vance is intellectually the most capable man in the room. And in the Starmer meeting, Trump actually asked Vance to speak. This is of interest. It's much more significant than I've seen vice presidents handled in the past. So Trump is behaving consistently, and increasingly, we will see all of the European leaders who meet with him will understand his disabilities and also understand the uncertainties and the risks of insulting him or being perceived to insult him. Well, that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question is, how is it different? Well, I've in the Dances with Bears, I've analyzed the Macron meeting and then the Starmer meeting. Uh, you can do it by measuring the amounts of time that was taken by Trump versus the others. Trump allowed Macron to say more than he allowed Starmer to say more. Second, Starmer was reduced to a handful of seconds, roughly 12% of the Oval Office press conference was Starmer's managing to get words in. Then, what's very interesting, and I'll go first to Starmer and then back to Macron. Starmer showed a level of hatred for the Russians a level of emphatic wanting to stay in war with President Putin. They can't even use the term President Putin, let alone Mr. Putin. It's always Putin. Starmer is a Russia hater. He's a race hater whose doctrine of fighting Russia goes back to the British fighting of the Crimean War. It's obvious in Starmer's case. He can't control it. What was obvious also was that he showed up late at the White House. What was then planned to be a press conference at 2 in the afternoon was delayed by 90 minutes. It seems clear to me that Starmer and Trump or their staffs had a real trouble making their positions more acceptable in their public presentations. And you can see Starmer's script on the lectern, curled pages that he was reading from or trying to read from had been corrected over and over or several times over. In other words, there were serious disagreements or failures to agree between Starmer and Trump. And Trump begins at the second press conference, 90 minutes late, by saying Starmer was a tough negotiator and he doesn't really like it. On the other hand, Trump did his best to minimize insults and emphasize what the British had come for, the celebration of the so-called special relationship between Britain and the United States. And that turned into a slogan for Trump, whom the British complimented and appeased by inviting him through King Charles III to make another state visit to England. Why don't you ask the next question, and then I can get into more detail of what it was that Starmer wants to do that Trump has having trouble understanding but doesn't want to do.
The main question in a particular moment, Donald Trump asked Starmer if they can take on Russia by themselves. What does that mean when he's talking this way to Starmer? It seems that it shows us that behind the scene they were talking. Starmer was talking about fighting Russia together, even without the United States. What does
Well,
that mean to you?
yeah, you're right to remember that particular line. It stands out like a dog's leg. Yes, it does. On the one hand, Starmer wants to continue war fighting against Russia. Um, on the other hand, everybody understands, and certainly Trump understands, that the UK has no weapons that it can use on the Ukrainian battlefield, either Storm Shadow missiles or Challenger tanks or aircraft, which the Russian side hasn't destroyed and defeated over the last 3 years. Second, the British Army is small and incapable of mounting anything, any operation beyond a small special operations gang of cutthroats. It can do special operations, but it can't run an army. So what is being discussed, as if it's reasonable, is that Starmer wants to put British boots on the ground, but only on condition that they are fully protected from the air and on the ground by the United States, which means essentially a US military guarantee for any so-called peacekeeping force. Macron never made such a position. The odd thing about this is that Starmer is raising and demanding and insisting on and emphasizing conditions which are completely unacceptable to the Russian side. And this has been repeated over and over. uh, Trump and Starmer appear to have discussed the idea that first there should be a ceasefire, and then that would be followed by some form of um, military withdrawal and political settlement. This is not acceptable to the Russian side, and it's been repeated over and over from Putin, President Putin, from Foreign Minister Lavrov, from spokesman Peskov, and so forth. Repeatedly, Russia will not accept a ceasefire or a freeze of conflict along the line of conflict. Why should it? It's already advancing. The other side is crumbling. The Russian army is winning slowly, with some limitations tactically, operationally, and so forth. But you don't, why would the Russians accept a ceasefire to enable the other side to rearm? We've been through that. We went through that with the Minsk protocols, now admitted by President Hollande of France and Chancellor Merkel of Germany, to have been a pause to refresh their military capabilities and prepare to fight again. Why does Starmer push a ceasefire? And then you've got the concept of a peacekeeping force composed of the British, the French, the Europeans. Trump repeats it in a slogan form. Starmer repeated it also. There's much more subtlety with the French position. But why is Starmer repeating things everyone knows are unacceptable to the Russians? Well, that leaves us with one interpretation only. It's the perfidious Albion interpretation. The British can't fight on the ground. Their method is deception, propaganda, the English language as a weapon. What Starmer is doing is proposing a peace agreement that is known to be unacceptable from beginning to end to the Russian side. Even Trump knows that, although he keeps repeating, as you heard him say, that we'll try to get Ukrainian land back. But even Trump, who repeated that several times over, um, acknowledges his own skepticism that it will be possible. So basically, Starmer wants to continue fighting and is offering the appearance of peace talks that constitute essentially a deception and can't make any progress unless the US commits to them. And Starmer is failing and failed to get Trump and Vance and the US delegation to sign on to the British conditions, as was repeatedly asked of Starmer and Trump. Will the US provide a military backing for any peacekeeping force that might involve the British? And the answer is evasive and sloganeering on the part of Trump. He basically goes back to saying, we will be in the Ukraine because we will be digging holes, digging to our heart's content. I think it was Trump's notion, a very peculiar way of describing mining in a conflict zone. It's absurd, but we can get back to the text of the minerals agreement later. In my judgment, Starmer isn't serious about reaching an end to war. Trump is more serious, but completely foggy and incapable of understanding the details. And Macron is quite serious. I'm speaking only in relative terms, and I'm not speaking politically in favor of Macron in France. That's out of the question from my point of view. However, there's a subtlety and a practical opportunity in what Macron had to offer, which has been picked up on the Russian side, discussed by my sources in Moscow, and is in discussion and debate in Moscow. What Macron is offering is essentially a security architecture in which the US would withdraw its principal forces and concentrations and its nuclear arms away from those parts of Eastern Europe where they threaten Russia most. That's Regekovo, the Aegis onshore nuclear weapons base in northern Poland, and Devesilu, the same Aegis nuclear weapons missile base in northern Romania. What Macron is suggesting is a form of preserving NATO, but rolling back the most dangerous from a Russian point of view weapon systems. That's a practical possibility that's negotiable with the Russians, but it would directly conflict with Starmer's notion of keeping the US behind a British soldier's back. There is, although Starmer and Macron say they've been negotiating and have been negotiating what Starmer and Macron call an Anglo-French plan, there was no sign to me in anything Starmer said that the French plan is identical in key respects from a Russian point of view to the British plan. The British want to go on fighting Russia because Starmer hates Russia. The French are not like that, and neither is Trump.
When you look at the European countries and the way that try to talk with Donald Trump one by one instead of having a meeting between all of them, European countries together with
Yes.
Donald Trump, do you think the main issue is the differences in their sort of policy toward Russia, toward the conflict in Ukraine? Because the meeting between Donald Trump and the Polish president Duda lasted 11 minutes. It was nothing, almost nothing. It seems that
Yes.
it was. It's how do you find the policies of the European countries, or can they find a common ground to deal with the conflict in Ukraine and then talk with Donald Trump? Or you see these differences are so much important, so much radical that they cannot get along with each other?
It's a big question, and we'd have to go from all over Europe. The very short meeting between Trump and President Duda of Poland was really a Polish intention, given that there's a presidential election coming up in Poland, in which the country split in half. East minimizes the Russian threat and emphasizes the German threat to Poland. The East is more likely to vote for Duda's party. The West of Poland more likely to vote for the current Tusk government. In the same way that Germany is divided east from west. In East Germany, the election clearly was won by the AfD, the Alliance for Germany, and a combination, and both the CDU and of course the SPD, the Social Democrats, the Scholz coalition, and the Greens were all very badly defeated in East Germany, and it's the opposite in West Germany. Because of these internal political divisions that structure the politics of these countries at different parts of the election cycle for each of them, they're each responding to their own domestic constituencies and playing politics with their domestic factions, parties, and voters. This is normal, it's appropriate, it's democratic. To assemble a common European alliance view on spending more money, lifting the defense budgets in countries which are desperately short of social welfare spending, as Britain is extremely difficult for all of these states. And we've seen the impact of the war and the economic war against Russia, raising the costs of electricity, gas, heating, water, everything that makes life possible in Europe has been severely damaged by each country's commitments to war against Russia, economic war as well as military war. So putting everybody in the same room doesn't work until it's clearer what the US itself aims to do, and that's not clear. Yes, President Putin says, and it's right to say, there's reason for a certain hope that the pragmatism of the US side is the basis for a negotiation, one on an end of war on the battlefield, about which Trump sloganizes all the time: deaths, 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 young people being killed, buildings being flattened. He keeps repeating the same images. Why? Because he can't read. Trump sees pictures. That's how he's briefed. And until we get to a level of detail in which we can understand what the US practically is ready to do, it's not possible to bring together the different political systems: France, Germany, Italy, the UK, Spain, the old NATO allies on the one hand, and the relatively new, the post 97 NATO members: Poland, the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Eastern Europe, essentially. Their needs, their social internal needs, are all common. The costs of fighting Russia are unbearable for them all, but the costs are different between Germany, Poland, Britain, and Italy, and so forth. So I don't see, for the time being, the possibility of concerted Europe-wide meeting. It's difficult enough for the Americans at the table: Trump, Vance, Rubio, Waltz, and Hegseth. It's difficult enough for them to concert and form their own consensus. It's equally difficult on the other side of the table for the Europeans. So it's best to do what they're doing, which is bilateral sounding out of the possibilities. And ultimately, from that sounding out process will come an American negotiation with Russia, in which reality really will dawn. And that's not what Starmer wants, but it is conceivably what Macron can live with, Meloni of Italy can live with, the Spaniards can live with. What will happen in the negotiations between now and Christmas, as Mr. Merz tries to form a coalition out of an extremely poor showing of the CDU in the German election, 28.5%, with the country split down the middle geographically, is not a formula for producing consensus on German rearmament, meaning rearmament to fight Russia. They haven't got a position yet. They haven't even got a government yet.
When you mentioned the mineral deal between the United States
Yes.
and Ukraine, how do you see the position of the United Kingdom? Do they really want to be part of that deal? That's why they're just putting
Well,
some sort of
I think that
policy.
I think they've already are part of the deal. It reminds me of the negotiations, if that's quite the right word, uh, and the competition between, on the one hand, the British, and on the other hand, the Americans, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, after World War One, as they were seeking to establish their own oil concessions in Iran, as you know very well, and in the Arab sheikdoms along the Persian Gulf, and the Saudi oil, Saudi, Syrian, and other Arab oil deposits. The British and the Americans competed fiercely in Saudi Arabia, lobbying Abdulaziz, for example, during World War II, between 43, let's say, when Kim Philby's father, St. John Philby, was the principal British lobbyist for the oil companies and for oil concessions in Saudi Arabia, versus Marine Colonel Bill Eddy, who was the principal US lobbyist for oil concessions. Uh, the British, and that story was repeated in Iran, it was repeated elsewhere. What we have now on the carcass of the Ukraine is a British agreement. Starmer called it a 100-year pact. I can't believe that in the small print of Starmer's 100-year pact with Zelenskyy, there wasn't British access to the same mineral resources that Trump is talking about. But Trump isn't so impolite, neither is Starmer so impolite, as to reveal that they're competing with one another. But if you look at the text of the mineral agreement, the mineral investment agreement, which was released by the Ukrainians 2 or 3 days ago and then found its way into the Financial Times and in the Western press. That text you can read on Dances with Bez. I've run the link and analyzed the provisions. It concedes in small print, subtly, much too subtle for Donald Trump, that pre-existing agreements, meaning concessions which Zelensky's already signed with the British, would not be included in what's available to the Americans. So you've got a mess of porridge, a kasha that the Americans want to scoop up with the Ukrainians, and the British have already beaten them to the punch, so to speak, with their 100-year agreement. Of course, nothing Zelenskyy signs would necessarily be honored by a successor government after the so-called martial law and unconstitutional period ends. So it's a very interesting point you've raised. The Americans are in competition with the British, probably the French too, over what's left of the carcass worth their while. And Trump decorates that by fictions, first about the accessibility of the rare earth minerals in the Ukraine. They're not accessible. The other minerals that are accessible are in Russian territory now, in the Donbass: coal, iron ore, oil and gas in the seabed off Crimea. So there is an unstated competition. And Trump's doing what Americans have always done to the British in Iran and in the Arab world. And that's been covered up.
Actually, the way that Donald Trump tried to, in my opinion, humiliate Starmer by saying, "Can you take on Russia by yourselves?" It comes to this deal between Ukraine and the United States. I do believe that Donald Trump is just dealing with Starmer on the scene that shows that this is the United States that's running the show.
Yes.
And you can do nothing with Russia without the United States. That's why we are getting the deal. You're not be part of. Maybe later we can talk about the deal, but we are the one who will negotiate with Zelensky and Ukraine on the mineral deal, on rare earth mineral. Do you
Yes,
think
I think you're right, Nima, to point out that that was a humiliation by Trump of Starmer. And it was a reminder of who calls the shots. Yes, I entirely agree with you. And it's noticeable that no one in the British press has noticed it. There's some very, very strange things very strange things that the Western press, the Anglo American press, have failed to notice. Take Canada, for example. What was quite extraordinary toward the end of the second press conference in the East Room, not the Oval Office one, a Canadian reporter asked Starmer and Trump, uh, having taken into account that King Charles III had delivered an invitation through Starmer to make an unusual new state visit to England, what did the king think? What did Starmer think of Trump's threats to take over, annex, turn Canada into the 51st state? He said it very politely. It was very cleverly worded, and it went to both Trump and Starmer. Starmer tried to evade the answer by talking around the subject. And then he lowered his voice. You can't see this in the transcript. You've got to listen to it and watch it. And at a very low voice, he says, and we discussed Canada. After saying, you're just trying to expose a division between us and the Americans. But we discussed Canada, he says in a low voice. Then what happens is also extraordinary and indicative. He, the reporter, has the right to a follow up for that answer. But Trump says that's enough and stops that line of questioning and moves the question to some other part of the room. In other words, Trump didn't want to allow any recollection of what had happened on Canada. What does one conclude that the British press won't notice, that the Canadian press is having trouble noticing? But all Canadians heard it, and all of us have to understand it. What happened is the perfidious Albion betrayed their own dominion. The British betrayed Canada right then and there in order to get a trade deal for England or for Britain, relief from the tariffs that Trump is threatening to impose on Europe. And second, he betrayed the Canadians for some military backing of what Starmer wants to do to continue the fight against Russia. Now, this is in historical terms, Starmer betrayed Canada for a takeover, an invasion by a country that the Brits need to depend on more than they want to even defend their own dominion. It's an extraordinary episode that will resound in Canada, and it will possibly assist Mark Carney, the Liberal leader in waiting, to win the next Canadian election. But that remains to be seen. Carney, the Liberal leader, has made no statement yet on what Starmer did. Neither has Poilievre, the Tory leader in Canada. But as a political demonstration, what we saw was a British leader abandoning their own empire for an American takeout. Extraordinary.
John, when you look at the way that Donald Trump started with Canada and Mexico, two important, extremely important countries in terms of the security of the United States,
Yes.
and then moving to Europe, right now he's talking about 25% tariffs on Europe.
Mm.
What would be that message to European countries? Because if they can do this to Canada and Mexico, what would happen to Europe? And there has to be some sort of understanding among the European countries how to deal with the United States in a long run. It's not just about Ukraine and what's going on in Ukraine, it's beyond that. It's about the conflict between the United States and China. What would that be for Europe? What does that mean for Europe? Is there any sort of understanding? Do you see any sort of concern on the part?
Well, you certainly can see the understanding. You can see the pressures, and the pressures are affect each country differently. And I'm not so familiar with each country. I can tell you, for example, that the pressure that Trump uh, is making has been likened to an extortion racket on the part of even the mainstream British press that's gung ho for war against Russia. They've called him, I think it was The Guardian, called him editorially a mafia boss. And the concept uh, that that Trump is extorting his lower level European allies is easy to understand. Of course, it's not Trump that began this system. This is how the US Protectorate of Europe works. Poland readily contributed billions of dollars in purchases of US aircraft, of US tanks, of US Patriot missile systems, and so forth and so on, under the Biden administration, under a previous Polish government, uh, without a significant internal debate that the Americans were extorting them, that the Americans were running a protection racket. Empires always run protection rackets. The Romans, the ancient Greeks, you name the empire, getting the vassals, the slaves of the empire, the dependents of the empire to pay for the protection is the way empires work, and it's the way empires become profitable. And when they're not profitable, they break up. Okay, even in a small country like Switzerland, you see the strain of breakup happening right now. In the last few weeks, Switzerland has lost its defense minister, its head of intelligence, and its army. All three have resigned suddenly, almost together, not holding hands, individually. They've all resigned without any significant explanation, either individually or in the paper, in the Swiss press of Geneva in French or in German in Zurich. What has happened to Switzerland, a very small country but an important one, is it gave up its neutrality to do what the Biden administration, the Blinken gang, demanded of Switzerland regarding the war against Russia. And it gave up its bank secrecy to the US Treasury demands under the Blinken administration. Neutrality gone, bank secrecy gone, the fundamental structure of the Swiss, let's call it financial services posture, and its traditional neutrality in conflict in Europe were destroyed by consent of the Swiss leadership. Now, the defense minister, the head of the army, and the head of the intelligence service are resigning. Is that because Trump doesn't trust them, or because they can't live in the world that they themselves created over the last 4 years? I don't know. My Swiss colleagues tell me this is what's happened, but they are guessing as to why it happened. The only source I've got tells me that the Trump administration is putting such new pressure on Switzerland that it's unbearable for the defense ministry, the army, and the intelligence service. Exactly what that pressure involves, I don't know yet. So if that can happen to Switzerland, to the neutrality of Austria, the neutrality of Ireland, then Trump's intensification of pressure will cause very significant breakup of political alliances in each of these countries. And these are the small ones. The much bigger ones we can see from the election in Germany are simply divided down the middle. territorially, geographically, ideologically, by age group, by social class.
John, we have two different attitudes on the part of the United States and Russia toward the way that they're behaving Zelensky. Russia says Zelensky is not the official president of Ukraine. That's why he cannot be part of negotiation. He cannot sign any sort of deal between Russia and Ukraine together with the United States. On the other hand, Trump is trying to make a deal with Zelensky, and it seems that for I don't know, for the next decade, for the next 100 years, because it's unbelievable the way that Donald Trump is trying to do that. Because after all, there has to be an official president in Ukraine signing that deal. That doesn't seem to be the case. Are they really concerned about that? Is the United States concerned about, about Zelensky and his position? Why is there that difference between the United States and Russia? Because Russia is understanding the situation in Ukraine much easier than the way that Donald Trump is capable of.
Well, it's a very good question, Neiman, and in a way, I'm not the right person to answer it. I'm based in Moscow to view the answer to your question from a Russian point of view. On the other hand, it's impossible not to see, on the one hand, uh, Trump uh, attacking Zelensky for not signing the minerals agreement that the new US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent took to Kiev a couple of weeks back. Exactly what was in the text that Zelensky rejected has not been revealed. During the argument, as you say, as your question refers, uh, Trump insulted Zelensky and reminded him that which side of the bread the butter is and who provides it, and called him a dictator. Now, yeah, on Thursday in Washington, as you remember, Trump was asked about calling Zelensky a dictator. And he said, "Did I say that? I don't believe I said that." So he took it back. And the reason he took it back is that Zelensky is on the way to sign the deal that was enough for Trump to achieve. Uh, these are games at the end of a regime. Um, I've suggested in print that the warnings that Trump was delivering, some crude, some as subtle as Trump is capable of. Subtlety is not his strong suit. Words aren't his strong suit. Um, are reminiscent of the way the Vietnam War ended, in which the US murdered Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam, and then subsequently had problems with each of the successive military officers in Vietnam as their war was being lost. Clearly, people below the level of Trump and his ministers, so the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the head of intelligence, is below that level. There are mid-level officials who are being put in place. We can talk about their names in a minute. They're all committed Russia war fighters. Those people want to achieve some sort of a transition that involves an election and a replacement of Zelensky and a restabilization of the political forces in Kiev that would be stable enough to maintain whatever it is the US wants, that Russia will allow them to have left after the Russian army does the job, completes its movement west, and completes the demilitarization objective of the special military operation. The Russian position is negotiable with the American position if the Americans accept that there must be an election and Zelensky's gone. But Zelensky, Budanov, and all of the others that represent the Russia hating, race hating, fascist structure of Kievan rule, that's also got to go. How that can be negotiated, how to prevent the long term establishment of a Lvov state that's a terrorist state, a military state that would be committed forever to fighting Russia and hating the Slavs. How to do that is a major problem. It's a multi-year problem. Politicians who can't live so long and can't expect voters to support them for so long will want to postpone. But what Trump has done towards Zelensky is a display of American imperialism of a perfectly normal kind. It was a polite invitation to get packing and move. And he backed off because from underneath come the officials in the State Department, Louis Bono, from the Pentagon, Elbridge Colby, from the uh, from the CIA, Ratcliffe CIA, and from the Budget Bureau, where the money is paid for these special operations. From this level of official comes the modification, so that the US position is preserved in whatever successor to Zelensky, whatever successor regime that will be, and it's likely not to be Petro Poroshenko, but much more likely to be General Zaluzhny. This is the South Vietnam pattern. It's the Americans playing politics as they lose their war, and it's the Russian job to fight the war to the Russian end and let the Americans pick up the pieces that are left for the Americans to pick up in Lvov and Kiev. Those pieces won't include Zelensky. They might include Zaluzhny, but the Russian drive has to be demilitarization with a demilitarized zone between the westernmost line of Russia, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Lugansk, and Odessa, and the Polish, somewhere between the demilitarized zone's got to be west of Kiev. As far as the Polish border, let's see. These are negotiables. But the political structure of the rump of the Ukraine follows after Russia's achieved its military objectives.
John, when you see Donald Trump, the way that he's talking about the security guarantee to Ukraine and the United States not being part of that security guarantee, and he says that European countries they can provide that. How do you see the picture on the part of the Russians? Do they really believe that would be a good sign, or is a bad sign because of the experience? We know what does that mean. It can be a positive sign for Russians, but after all, considering the 2014 and 2015 Minsk one and Minsk two, they want the United States to be part of this deal, not to be part of being the main signature to this deal between Russia and the West. If Donald Trump decides to withdraw, to take everything out of Ukraine, who's gonna say that in the future, the United States, I don't know, they're gonna change the new president after 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency, there's gonna be a new president and he's gonna make new policies in Ukraine and in Europe. that would that may change everything in Europe. Here comes the main doubt on the part of Russians. What do they want the United States to be? How can they be involved in Ukraine the way that doesn't concern that much Russia in terms of the future of Ukraine and their concern about the NATO expansion and all of that?
Well, this is a very difficult question. The framework that Russia has tabled as the non-aggression reciprocal security treaty with the United States of December 17, 2021, and the parallel treaty with NATO at the same time, would involve uh, uh, a, a redesign of security architecture in which the principal nuclear and long range missile threats to Russia would be removed. The US would withdraw. And I've just mentioned that Regekovo in northern Poland and Devasilu in northern Romania are, let's call them the touchstones of this new security architecture under the 2021, December 2021 treaties that, in my judgment, Macron implied would be negotiable, not Starmer. Second, uh, the practical reach of long term security for the general staff must be a demilitarized zone deep enough to prevent long range drones, missiles, rockets, artillery from ever threatening Russia again, either the new Novorossiya or the hinterland of Russia. Now, that's a tall order. It's not, I'm not telling anybody any news. Mr. Lavrov has described the depth. President Putin has referred to the sanitary zone. That's what it must mean in military terms. And Russia has to be able to enforce it by intelligence means on the ground, by satellites, drones, and other forms of patrol. What does the presence of peacekeeping forces mean? Well, in fact, practically speaking, such a peacekeeping force, and I wish people would understand this, has to be on the western side, the western line of the demilitarized zone to prevent the fascists from Lvov coming back. They're the ones who threaten to destabilize a peace agreement after the Ukraine has been defeated as the Russian side is defeating it. So the demilitarized zone could have peacekeeping forces, but they would be essentially an anti terrorist force protecting what's left of the Ukraine and the western border of Russia, the Novorossiya border, from terrorism coming from Lvov. That's how it would be structured. Can it be done? Yes, it can be done technically. Is it expensive? Yes. But here's a problem. It's a problem for Russians to debate now, and it's a problem for Russian politicians in Kremlin versus the general staff. What is the time frame that you're building a military deconfliction zone with the Americans and the others? What's the time frame in which it can last before war starts again? Politicians include, and they're normal in Moscow, inside the Kremlin, as they are everywhere else, have a relatively limited time horizon. And President Putin's succession and successors are already thinking of what's the time, how does the war end in a way that advantages or changes the succession between now and 2030, for example. So many Russian sources tell me that they would be satisfied with a structure that would last 5 to 10 years, better 10 years than 5, in the expectation that the war will restart again. Now, militarily, General Staff doesn't like such a short-term advantage. Politicians consider short-term as long-term because it lasts as long as they're in power. So that the Russian succession to President Putin has to be concerned about this timeline. Nobody wants to succeed the president in the Kremlin and face a resumption of war. So, how to construct a long enough period of no war for Russia to recover, for the Novorossiya to be redeveloped, and so forth and so on. That's an argument in Russia right now. It's a sensible debate. People of goodwill can differ with one another. We are yet to see a consensus that goes onto the negotiating table with the Americans.
You remember before the talks between the United States and Russia taking place, you mentioned that if there is some sort of talks between the United States and Russia, then Russia should talk with China, Iran, and North Korea.
Yes.
Right now, we know that they have sent Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to Iran, and right now Shoigu is in China talking with Chinese. How
I've lost your voice. Back again? Can't hear. Still can't hear. Can you hear? Can you hear me?
yeah,
We're back again.
yeah, we're back.
Okay.
Have you heard my question, John?
No.
The question was that Russia right now has Shoigu in China and has
Yes.
sent Sergei Lavrov to Iran.
Yes.
What's going on the part of Russians? How are they trying to manage with two with these two countries, their allies? And what was the necessity of having these two meetings in China and
Well,
Iran? Is that part of what's going on between Russia and the United States?
well, yes, and we had a useful discussion about that the last time, Nim, as you remember. Um, let's call this the ghost of Bashar al-Assad. The ghost. Um, the reason that it was necessary for Russia at high level. President Putin spoke to President Xi Jinping. As you said, Foreign Minister Lavrov went to Johannesburg for a G20 meeting and met a great many allies, including the Foreign Minister Jai Shankar of India, and President Putin may be in India to meet Prime Minister Modi in a few weeks' time. The purpose of all of these meetings is to first of all explain Russia will stick to its commitments and will not abandon any of its commitments as their allies might interpret what Russia did with in Syria. So it's not just an explanation, a briefing on what is happening between in the Russian US talks. It's not simply this is what's happened at Riyadh. This is how we see the follow up from Riyadh. This is what Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's money man, is proposing to do with Trump's money man, Stephen Vitkov. This is what the different constituencies in Moscow, the oligarchs, would like out of a war settlement. It's not simply a briefing like that. That's an important element, but it's a briefing about what happened in Syria and why allies, strategic allies, Iran, North Korea, China, and India, should not believe that Russia betrays its commitments. That too is part of the discussion, because there are elements inside Moscow, particularly business elements, particularly those pushing Kirill Dmitriev, President Putin's special emissary for economic negotiations with the United States. There are elements who would betray for their commercial interest. So it's good politics and good strategy to have done what you've just described happened. It's another matter again what the Chinese interpret, what the Iranian side interprets, what the Indian side interprets of what they've heard from the Russian side, and what questions, if any, remain, and what doubts might remain. Those doubts, if there are any, skepticism, Chinese skepticism, Indian skepticism, Iranian skepticism, Korean skepticism, is under wraps. It's behind closed doors. If we knew it, I mightn't say it.
Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you very much for having me, Nima. Until next time.
Yeah, see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you.